Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Sustainability is no longer a side conversation in pharmaceutical manufacturing. It is becoming part of how companies think about supply selection, process development, operational resilience, and long-term competitiveness. Many pharma and biotech companies now have ambitious climate goals, but the reality is that the biggest challenge often sits outside their own walls, across upstream manufacturing and supply chains. That is where questions become more difficult. What does a lower carbon process actually look like? How do you measure progress in a way that is useful, not just reportable? And how do you improve sustainability without compromising cost, quality, speed, or scalability? These are not just ESG questions, they are chemistry, engineering, and manufacturing questions. So in today's conversation, we'll look at how green chemistry and process innovation are reshaping the sustainability discussion in pharma, and what companies are looking for in partners who want to play a real leadership role in that transition. To discuss that, I'm joined by David Ennis, Executive Advisor to PharmaBlock and former VP of Chemical Development at AstraZeneca, and Celine Chen, Head of PharmaBlock Europe. Thanks for joining me both. Dave, let's start with you. Sustainability has been on the agenda for years, but why does this topic feel more and more urgent now in pharmaceutical manufacturing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you. I think the conversation has changed in a number of important ways. First, there's a greater appreciation of urgency across healthcare and the pharmaceutical sectors. The climate crisis is the most urgent risk to human health. There's compelling data showing the rising burden of chronic disease, for example, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, and that's putting increasing strain on healthcare systems, on their ability to pay for new innovative medicines, for example. So addressing climate change has actually become business critical in the pharma sector. We also step back. Healthcare actually contributes to global carbon emissions. It's approximately 5%, which is almost double that of the aviation industry. And supply of medicines is a significant component of those emissions. So a business critical ambition to move towards net zero healthcare to benefit people, society, and the planet does require collective action across those medicines supply chains. So that's why I think we're seeing sustainability is actually moving beyond compliance to a business performance lever. So, for example, driving supply chain resilience, having greater visibility of risk in supply chain, protecting margins for companies, and helping to build competitive advantage. So what I believe is it's now becoming part of value-based strategies, such as supply chain strategy, procurement criteria, and long-term operational resilience. We also see companies are under increasing pressure from payers, from regulators, from investors, from customers, and society in general to show credible progress, not just ambition. I think the other major area for me is the industry actually has recognized where the real challenge sits. So in pharma, some of the big players have made really impressive reductions in carbon emissions and use of natural resources that they control on their own sites and in their own operations. So their scopes 1 and 2. But a very large share of emissions sit in those companies' value and supply chains, i.e. their scope 3, especially in purchased goods and services that includes upstream manufacturing. So for me, it's really important not just to focus on renewable electricity or site level utilities, which are important, but it's also, there's a recognition there's a need to address the biggest part of the problem. And that's why I think this topic has become more urgent. The question is no longer whether sustainability matters. The question is, where are the practical levers and how companies can act in ways that are measurable, scalable, and commercially realistic to mitigate business risk and increase value.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And that stat, healthcare causes almost double the carbon emissions of the aviation industry, really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Over 80% of pharma's emissions can be attributed to scope 3, which is huge, isn't it? It really is the bulk of it. Celine, I know one of the themes PharmaBlock talks about is that decarbonization in pharma is not just an energy question, but a chemistry question. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, first, I would like to just elaborate a little bit on Dave's point about the Scope 3 emissions. So we know that the majority of pharma's carbon footprint is from Scope 3, and the majority of the Scope 3 carbon footprint is from that of the purchased goods, which is embedded in how the molecules are made. So if a process has too many steps, lower yield, high solvent consumption, difficult separations, harsh conditions, or safety constraints, then the carbon footprint is already being built in this process itself. So even if you improve the energy mix later, the process may still remain inefficient from either the carbon or the cost perspective. So that is why we believe that decarbonization must start earlier at the chemistry and process design stage. So you need to ask, can we redesign this route? Can we improve the reaction efficiency? Can we avoid the hazardous or wasteful steps? Or can we apply a more greener technology, such as green chemistry, continuous flow, or biocatalysis? So for us, green chemistry is not an add-on. It is about redesigning the way that manufacturing happens.
Dave, from the perspective of large pharma in your history at AstraZeneca, where do companies typically struggle when they try to move from sustainability commitment to actually executing on those goals?
No, it's again another great question, and I think anyone working in the sustainability area and looking at how you apply it across a business has come across a number of challenges. So I'd say, a common challenge is that many companies have targets, but they don't yet have enough operational pathways behind those targets to align people and activities across the organization. So I would argue that it's relatively straightforward to announce a goal. It's much harder to translate that goal into decisions that you're making. So, for example, as Celine said, if you're looking at decisions about route selection, supplier engagement, process development, technology investment, and manufacturing strategies, that's really key that you can make decisions around that aligned with your goals. So I think another challenge, again, I've lived through this, is measurement. So that really, for me, there are two components around measurement. First, many organizations still only have a high-level view of emissions, so secondary data based on spend and emission factors. And that's really useful for reporting, but it's not enough for decision making. So if you can't see where emissions are generated at a process level, it becomes very difficult to know what to change and what to focus on. And actually, you can be in danger of deciding to change in certain areas, but that just shifts the burden somewhere else. So when I was at AstraZeneca, and I think they've done an amazing job. For example, they invested many years ago in the generation of life cycle analyses, and that's for products. And that really helped identify hotspots across a value chain to address where they could actually take action. But also having it across a portfolio of products meant that they could aggregate data and identify strategically what programs could actually help shift the bar. So that's one area of measurement. The second component is organizations can circle around data. So the need for more precise data when actually there is enough quality primary data to help identify the most significant hotspots and then be able to move to action. So I think that's a really important learning. I think the other is the business question. Teams often assume sustainability will cost more or increase complexity. In reality, the best solutions are often the ones that improve multiple dimensions at once. So again, if we took route and process design as example, shortening the synthetic route, as Celine has alluded to, improving process efficiency, they generally reduce cost, they reduce environmental impact, both from a carbon and a waste perspective. They shorten manufacturing lead times, help increase productivity, build robustness, and ensure that processes are run safely, all of which impact the value of a product. So that, I think, is where the industry is maturing. People are increasingly looking for partners who can connect sustainability with process reality and value.
So, what does sustainability leadership actually look like in practice for a CDMO or a CDMO? What makes that real rather than rhetorical? Celine, do you want to start?
So for us, it comes down to three things. Well, first, we need visibility into the carbon emissions of each module within a given process, just like Dave mentioned, like using the life cycle analysis or product carbon footprint to help identify the hotspots of the carbon emission. And second, we need the solutions for the high emission modules, such as technology capabilities to reduce the emissions of the process. If you want to reduce carbon at the process level, you need to use the tools to redesign the chemistry, not just talk about the targets. That includes the continuous flow technology, the process science, PAT, modeling, engineering, and today increasingly the biocatalysis and carbon intelligence. Well, third, I think we need to work transparently with both the customers and suppliers. So that means being open about where the carbon hotspots really are, what can we realistically improve, and what the trade-offs may be. And it also means taking the responsibility not only for our own emissions, but also for our scope 3 as a CDMO. So a large share of the emissions sits upstream in raw materials, in solvents, in reagents, the external supply chains. So for the CDMO company, the transparency for us means not only helping the customers to identify the product level hotspots, but also engaging our own suppliers to better understand, manage, and reduce the emissions across the broader chain.
Really, really interesting. And a good point as well about looking into your own scope 3 as a CDMO, because it is obviously that sort of multi-tiered supply chain there that just makes an impact, doesn't it? Celine, you also mentioned continuous flow. I know it's discussed as, an advanced manufacturing technology, but how do you connect that specifically to sustainability?
Well, continuous flow is important to us, not simply because it is a different reactor format, but because it enables a much more integrated way of developing and running the chemistry. Well, continuous manufacturing often gives the better yields and selectivity, which means lower starting material usage and less waste. So it also opens access to broader chemical space. For example, the high energy, the high temperature, and very fast reactions that are difficult or unsafe to scale in the traditional batch reactors. And that allows more efficient production of building blocks, intermediates, and APIs that might otherwise be very hard to manufacture at scale. Well, at PharmaBlock, we see the continuous flow as a system capability. So it starts with understanding the reaction mechanism, the intrinsic kinetics, the phase behavior, and transport effects. But from there, we also use the PAT, the modeling tools, and CFD simulation to understand mixing, heat transfer, residence, time distribution, and equipment behavior under the real operation conditions. So that understanding then feeds into the reactor design, engineering decisions, and process control strategy, and ultimately safe and reliable industrial implementation. So this matters for sustainability because better process understanding and better engineering usually lead to the better outcomes. And you can reduce byproducts, improve the yield, lower the solvent and raw material consumption, and enhance the safety and make the scale up more predictable. So in many cases, that means lower carbon footprint and better cost efficiency at the same time. What is also important is that this is not just a closed technology. It is an extensible platform. So continuous flow can be integrated with other green chemistry approaches, especially the biocatalysis. We can see that immobilized enzyme catalysis or the enzyme flow systems. That is where we see a lot of the future potential because sustainable manufacturing will increasingly come from the combining these strengths of chemistry, biology, and engineering.
So can you share an example actually of when this kind of green chemistry approach actually created some meaningful impact?
So one example we often reference is a continuous manufacturing process we developed for a cyclobutane carboxylic acid intermediate. So 2 metric tons of the product was successfully produced in 10 days by using this continuous process. And compared to the conventional batch process, our continuous process featuring the decarboxylation, the decolorization, extraction, and separation helps achieve 20-fold energy consumption and less workspace, stronger workforce efficiency with much lower PMI. And this product is used in the API synthesis of multiple marketed drugs. Well, this case also earned us the first Green Chemistry Award by ACS. So ACS picks only one CDMO in the world for this award every year. And we are the only one to take it home 2 years in a row. Well, we also see the same logic in the peptide manufacturing as well. So in a recent ACS article, which spotlights PharmaBlock's next generation peptide manufacturing, it describes how the traditional solid phase peptide synthesis can be highly resource intensive, while the integrated approaches using the LPPS, the continuous flow LPPS, the enzyme-assisted synthesis can create a more sustainable path to scale up the peptides. And this article also gives a cyclic peptide example. So we're moving from the SPPS to LPPS, we can reduce the DMF usage and to less than 1/20th of the original process and help to avoid the burden of the reserved phase chromatography. And that is a very strong example of how the green chemistry can improve both the environmental and manufacturing performance in these advanced modalities. So more broadly, what these examples show is when chemistry, engineering, and carbon thinking are aligned early, you often unlock both the environmental and the commercial value.
Congratulations on that award. That really is an achievement. So, Dave, tell me, from a former sponsor's perspective at AstraZeneca, what should pharma and biotech companies be asking their CDMO partners on sustainable manufacturing?
Yes, I think it's great. There's so many kind of options. So I've broken it down into what I think are 6 practical questions. First, have you committed to science-based targets for carbon emissions and other nature-based targets? And following on from those questions, do you have evidence of progress, not just intentions? I think secondly, can the partner measure carbon and waste in a way that is process relevant, i.e. primary data, and not just at the spend level? So these are important contributions because big pharma are being asked to provide overall LCA data and carbon footprints of processes in some marketing applications. And we're probably going to see that not too far away in the EU. Thirdly, can they identify the real hotspot in a route or a manufacturing process? Fourth, do they have technical options to help reduce those emissions in the way that Celine's described and the capabilities that PharmaBlock have, such as being able to carry out route redesign, be able to drive process intensification, access to flow chemistry or biocatalysis, solvent recycling, and new membrane technologies actually to aid that recovery in a more efficient way. And as Celine said, can people connect the sustainability activity with business impact? I think that the final really important point and question would be, do you have appropriate ambitions and plans and approaches to drive engagement and sustainability thinking further upstream in their supply chain? So I think that's the kind of questions I'd be asking of suppliers, but I think also buyers need to become more precise. So it's not enough just to ask whether a supplier has an ESG program and tick the box. The more useful question is whether they can actually help reduce the embedded footprint of the product itself.
Let's talk about carbon intelligence. It's one of those phrases that probably means something slightly different to everyone. What does carbon intelligence mean in your context?
Well, for us, the carbon intelligence means moving from the carbon reporting to the carbon informed decision making. So the first step is measurement. We need to have a credible baseline, ideally the cradle to gate product carbon footprint based on the real process data. And the second step should be the attribution and optimization. So you need to know where the emissions are coming from, which steps or variables matters most, and where the intervention will have the biggest effect. And the third step is prediction. So once you understand a process, you can begin to compare the scenarios. For example, what happens to carbon performances if the yield changes, if a step is redesigned, or if a batch process is replaced by continuous flow. Well, finally, over the time, as the data accumulates across the projects, you start to build the benchmarking and trend insights that can support the continuous improvement. So carbon intelligence is not just a dashboard. It is a way to connect the carbon with the chemistry, engineering, and process choices. So this matches the 4-layer carbon intelligence system described in our strategy deck: measurement and reporting, predictive modeling, carbon attribution and optimization, and finally, the long-term data intelligence.
That's a really interesting concept there. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the commercial side. Dave, this is something you alluded to earlier. A lot of people still assume sustainability means extra cost. Is that the wrong mindset?
Yeah, I think it's probably too simplistic a statement, but I think it's clear. Not every sustainability initiative creates immediate savings. But actually, if you look in manufacturing, some of the most effective sustainability improvements are also good operational improvements, as we've alluded to previously in the podcast. So better yield, increased throughput, less waste, safer processes, fewer deviations, smaller footprint, more stable scale up. Then they're not only environmental wins, they're actually business wins and create more value for the business. So I think the important shift is to stop treating sustainability as a separate work stream. When it's embedded into process design and supplier strategies, actually, it can become a much stronger performance lever. I think we live in a world where things are changing quite dramatically. The actually resilience of supply chains is really important. So if you have good visibility of your supply chain, a good understanding of that side of it, then actually that visibility ultimately will help protect margins.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we often summarize it very simply. Sustainability should be understood as carbon, cost, and safety together. So when a process becomes more efficient, you frequently improve all three. That is why we believe that sustainability should not be framed as a trade-off discussion by default. It should be framed as a smarter process development discussion.
Dave, let me ask a broader question. Looking ahead, what do you think will define sustainability leadership in pharma manufacturing over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think leadership will be defined by credibility and business integration. So what I mean by credibility is measurable action, not just declarations. Companies will increasingly need evidence that their decarbonization strategies, for example, are working at a product and supply chain level. And integration, I mean sustainability will no longer sit as a tick box exercise in a separate ESG area. It will be integrated into sourcing, process development, technology strategies, network design, and partner selection. And I think, companies that move early in this process and identifying process level solutions will have an advantage because, once regulatory expectations, customer expectations, and supply chain standards tighten further, they'll already have built the operating model and capabilities that others may still be trying to assemble.
Celine, as you build PharmaBlock's position in Europe and globally, What kind of conversations are customers most ready for today?
Well, the most productive conversation are the ones that move beyond the general sustainability ambition and into the specific manufacturing questions. So customers want to understand where the real reductions can come from. They want practical pathways. They want to know what is the material today, what can scale, what can support both their sustainability goals and their supply goals. So in Europe especially, there is very strong interest in solutions that combine the decarbonization with the technical competitiveness. So the conversation is not only about reporting, it is about how to build a lower carbon manufacturing model that is also robust, efficient, and future ready. So that is exactly where we believe that PharmaBlock can contribute by bringing together the chemistry innovation, the industrialization capabilities, and a structured carbon lens.
Finally then, if each of you could leave listeners with one, quick fire takeaway, what would it be in a nutshell?
So my takeaway would be this: if you want to decarbonize pharma meaningfully, you have to look inside the process.
Mine would be green chemistry is no longer a niche technical topic. It is becoming a strategic capability for how the pharmaceutical manufacturing will compete in the future.
What a nice sentiment to end on there. Thanks a lot, Celine and Dave.